and erode public support for open trade. Currently, subsidies are a main driver of trade tensions among some of our members. As such, they can have significant macroeconomic costs and trigger retaliatory action. WTO data shows that the number of new countervailing investigations per year has quadrupled in the last decade. But concerns over subsidy practices are also a key factor impeding discussions on other areas of trade reform. Addressing this issue is therefore of central importance to the global trading system at this particular juncture. This report seeks to help foster a substantive and objective discussion in that regard. Together, the four institutions have taken stock of what we know and what we don't know about subsidies and their international dimensions. It's a complex subject matter. Clearly, subsidies can be an important tool to address market failures. But examples abound where subsidies do little to achieve their intended goal or do so at an unnecessarily high cost domestically, abroad, or with regard to global commons. In building a broad coalition of interest across borders, it should be possible to improve their effectiveness, limit their international spillovers, and reduce harm to others. Both finance and trade ministries need to work together in this effort. Going forward, the report makes clear that of our four organizations intend to help in this endeavor. First and foremost, we need to have better information on subsidies. This means we need to better share existing information, identify the gaps in data, and fill those gaps. We need to better coordinate among ourselves to establish data collection priorities and properly coordinate on these tasks. We need to involve other relevant institutions and disseminate the results of these efforts in an easily accessible, user-friendly form. On the basis of improved and coherent data, we need to develop a better understanding of the actual effects of subsidy programs, to what extent they achieve their stated objectives, at what cost, and what are the impacts on other countries. Second, sound evidence and analysis can feed into dialogues across and within countries on how to improve existing subsidy schemes and minimize negative spillovers. The international organizations involved here already provide a range of fora where such dialogue could take place. Making use of fora in both trade and financial institutions is likely to provide additional momentum towards reform by combining a perspective on trade impacts and concerns about subsidies and with considerations of their fiscal implications and possible alternative uses of public funds. Last but not least, we need to support government's efforts in international rulemaking, notably in updating the WTO's rulebook. When these rules were made, many current developments affecting or being affected by the use of subsidies were not foreseen, notably the importance of climate change, the growth of the digital sector, or increasing international activity of state-owned enterprises. A better grasp on the prevalence of subsidy programs and their effects can help develop and shape the necessary rules. Not to forget, we are starting from a solid base of existing WTO rules, and a few adjustments and updates to those rules might already go a long way in boosting their effectiveness to address the challenges of today's world. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's start with that last point, which is today's world and these challenges that we have. It feels like, as both a producer of news and a consumer of news, I can't look anywhere nowadays without seeing some kind of article or discussion about the end of globalization, the end of an era of globalization. You four often get described as four of the guardians of globalization, right? I think if there was a Marvel superhero movie about globalization, you four might feature in it somehow. I wonder, when you think about this world, today's world that you're thinking about, are we at the end of an era? And how does that affect that whole discussion that you're having about subsidies and so on? And I'm going to start with you, Kristalina, because you're our host here today.
Okay, well, thank you. Great to have the fabulous four. And if we are to be heroes, as you suggested, I want to have wins. But let me get to a very serious question you're asking. We live in a rapidly changing world that is so interconnected that to imagine that we can wipe out this interconnectivity is simply not possible. If you make a list of the problems that no country can solve on its own, it is a very long list. It doesn't mean that globalization is not changing. First, we have to recognize that over the last decade, we have realized mistakes we have made by not paying sufficient attention to inequality, to the distribution of benefits of globalization within countries, across countries, and we cannot shy away from addressing these shortcomings. Second, we do have a multipolar world. There are different countries with economic strength. They have some, different interests, not entirely compatible, and that creates some tension, some friction. That doesn't mean we are throwing the baby with the bathwater. And three, as we imagine the world ahead of us, we have to be frank and recognize that there could be fragmentation that makes us all poorer unless we act to eliminate the dangers or reduce these dangers. What do I mean? If we end up in blocks that trade within each other and obviously don't achieve economic efficiency, but are more in a field of their understanding of security, we all would lose. And I can tell you in our meetings here, who were the voices more strongly arguing for the benefits of globalization? Emerging markets and developing economies, because they need to continue to grow using the benefits of globalization. But we can imagine a different world in which there is more diversification. In other words, maybe a little less efficiency, but more of a sense that supply chains are functioning. And across different interests, there are bridges and highways built. So we continue to take advantage of the strength we have together.
David, I'm going to come to you next because you are really our co-host here this week at these spring meetings. But I'm also interested because you, before you came to the bank, worked for a president who rose to power on the back of intense skepticism about globalization and a real message of economic nationalism. And I wonder, given the administration you served, your new role now, you've got an interesting viewpoint on this question. I mean, what do you think about where we're landing now?
I also worked in the Reagan and the Bush 41 administrations,
yeah.
And so I have strong views on this. One is that trade is really a very positive force. If you think of the cornerstone of development is commerce, is people trading because they get some efficiency from not making everything themselves. And that applies to a village, that applies to even to a household. There's some specific tasks that some of the family does better than other of the family. And so we need to really build on that and see the productivity from it. So I want to avoid a little bit the word globalization. That sounds almost like we're talking about agreements where all countries join in the same idea. That's hard to achieve. But what we have to preserve is the idea of efficiencies from companies trading with each other, people being able to sell their skills in different countries. But that gets us right to the point of this report. Subsidies distort that ability to do it efficiently. If I try to achieve globalization, but then some players are subsidizing, I'm undercutting my goal. So we need to find a way to have trade that occurs in an efficient way to get the gains for the people around the world. It's going to help the poorest people the most if they can have their skills be part of the global supply chain.
But we're clearly in a world where we're no longer focused on efficiency. We're focusing on national self-interest as well, right? And that is something that's playing out, Matthias, in well, your new home in France this weekend, where we are seeing that same discussion about national self-interest versus a greater international world, and really manifest itself in the election campaign there. I wonder, you know, as you said, you've come from Australia, which is a country that's benefited hugely from globalization. I say that as an Australian living here in Washington. But I wonder if you have a different take on it now.
Well, I mean, I think that Ngozi made a very important point in her presentation, and that is that global trade, doing business with each other around the world, has delivered enormous benefits to billions of people around the world over the last several decades. I mean, it has lifted many, many people out of poverty, but it's also true, it comes with challenges. I mean, exposing yourself to competition can be extremely disruptive and uncomfortable, but there's not really an alternative, because that is the engine of innovation and progress. Now, I think that the conversation that we ought to have is how we can manage global competition, global trade, and those sorts of disruptions better and make them work better for people. Because you know, when you have structural transformations like the digitalization of our economies at the same time as you are involved in global competition, entire population segments can be severely disrupted and need appropriate support to be able to participate and benefit from all of the upsides of global trade. And there's certainly an important role for public policy there. But I also want to support the point that David has made. The problem is that when we have a global market, and the idea is that we all do business with each other, and that whoever is able to deliver the best product or the best service at the best price is the one that supplies those products and services into markets around the world. But then you have governments interfering by providing subsidies and creating an unlevel playing field, creating unfairness, helping to keep businesses alive and successful, even though they're not competitive and not innovative, and squeezing out innovative and more competitive businesses in the process. Then everybody loses, and that is why it's so important to really focus on this work on subsidies, market distorting subsidies, which also create often environmentally harmful consequences because they drive overproduction. Right. So that there are many aspects. I think the way to look at globalization is that it's not a matter of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and stepping back from it. It's about making it work better for people.
Kristalina, you wanted to jump in quickly, or can I go to Ngozi?
Go to Ngozi, and then it will be my turn.
Ngozi, I feel like you have, again, a unique perspective. You have worked as a policymaker in Nigeria. You've also spent a lot of time here in Washington at the bank and elsewhere. And you are now at the WTO in Geneva, which once upon a time, and certainly should be again, the center of trade negotiations and where the rules are made for this. I wonder, do you think you are looking out at the end of an era here of globalization, or how do you think about it?
Well, let me build on what my colleagues have said and say that certainly there are challenges to globalization, and they've been articulated. But are we looking at the end of an era? I think we need to be very careful in saying that, in the sense that, look, this globalization, this multilateral trading system that has been built, it's a global public good. It took time to build it since the end of the Second World War. And it has delivered, as the point I made in my earlier presentation, lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty. So yes, it's not perfect. Some people have been left behind, poor people in rich countries. There are poor countries who have been left behind. But that does not mean that, as Kristalina had said, or was it Matthias, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. No, what we need to ask ourselves is, how do we improve? It cannot be the old globalization. How do we improve what we have? How do we reimagine globalization so that we can correct those problems and use it to lift more people out, what I call re-globalization. But we can't do it if we have lack of transparency. And these subsidies, many times they're hidden. And therefore, for us at the WTO, it leads to a break in trust. Because when members feel that certain members are giving subsidies and they are not notifying them and declaring them, they really feel it creates an unlevel playing field, which is why transparency, the data, getting things out on the table is critically important.
That was really an astonishing figure that jumped out at me in the report, was the number of countries notifying has gone down from something like 60-something% to 30% last year, which is amazing. Kristalina, you wanted to jump in.
Well, I wanted to make a point on enlightened self-interest, all the way back to Adam Smith, that we don't do it because we want to be good to others. We do it because it is good for us. And leaders that want to serve their populations, they don't want people to get poorer, they want them to be wealthier. And in that sense, one of our main tasks, and we probably haven't done a good enough job yet, is to calculate the cost of stepping back and the benefits of stepping forward. And the second point I want to make is that what is very troubling from this paper when you read it is that it really brings more in the hands of those who already have more. We calculated that agricultural subsidies are 447 billion. Out of this 447 billion, 376 in the four giants, the EU, the US, China, and India. So we have to think about fairness, without which we cannot sustain support for a trading system that is more efficient. And so we have to continue to both show what works, what doesn't, and who it works for and who it does not serve.
You've been measuring at the OECD, I guess not you personally, but the OECD has been measuring agricultural subsidies for something like 30 years now. What are the lessons you take from that exercise in measuring those subsidies? I mean,
well, firstly, they're overwhelmingly market distorting. It's a very inefficient way of providing income support to farmers. The politics of removing agricultural subsidies are very, very difficult. In fact, the politics of removing subsidies once introduced are incredibly difficult. And they also, I mean, they distort production decisions and have both economically and environmentally harmful consequences. And, you know, as we talk about the green transformation and moving forward towards carbon neutrality, removing environmentally harmful subsidies, and most of the agricultural subsidies is going to be a very important part of the equation. And it is about having a level playing field, making sure that resources are allocated to where they can have the most beneficial economic impact for everyone. And subsidies really distort that greatly.
It's not just agricultural subsidies, of course, it's industrial subsidies. And I mentioned semiconductors in my opening remarks. And I think energy. That debate, energy is there as well. But I wonder, you know, there's a very live political debate in places like the United States pushing for greater industrial policy, pushing for subsidies in areas like semiconductors and really trying to domesticate a lot of that production or to bring production home. Reshoring is a word that all politicians here in America have embraced as an idea. I wonder, David, I mean, not just what do you see given your experience in government, going back to the Reagan administration when you see that debate here, but when in your new role, when you think about the consequences of that for the poorer nations especially.
Couple of thoughts. One is it's really expensive. Two is we have to live in the real world. It's a political and pragmatic world. And so what we can do is try to identify some of the most costly and distortive subsidies and work on those. I think it's hard to even define subsidies. What if one country has better infrastructure than another? Then they become competitive. Or if they've gotten the leap on digitalization, is that a subsidy that gives them a comparative advantage over their competition? One of the very expensive subsidies the U.S. is doing now is for ethanol. So is that environmentally sound? It's distorting the corn markets massively at a time when the world needs corn. So one of the things I think we can do in the report and among us as institutions is to identify the things that are most distortive. I think we have to put it in the same basket as price controls. Those end up being distortive and costly. One immediate problem that we face as commodity prices go very high, the temptation for politicians to subsidize is there, and oftentimes the cost goes up automatically as the price goes up. If you've decided that you're going to produce a certain amount of ethanol, the cost goes through the roof as the bushels of corn price goes up. So how do governments control themselves, and realize that it's costly, harmful to your own people, and then distortive in the global system that hurts the formation of capital in the direction that we want. We want to let people invest in the things that are going to be productive into the future, and these subsidies really stop that process.
But it goes to an important point, though, because there are legitimate circumstances in which subsidies can be useful. I mean, market failure, national security related or strategic circumstances. But the key is the design. I mean, the design of the subsidies, making sure it's appropriately targeted with the view of minimizing market distortions. And often that is where we let ourselves down, where we don't do enough work on designing those subsidies properly to achieve the intended purpose and minimize negative consequences.
And part of the reason for that, though, is because we live in a world in crisis right now, right? There is a food price crisis in the world today. We just wrote this week about really how, if you look out at emerging economies today, they are facing a set of shocks that is akin to what we've seen since we were seeing in the 1990s.
And yet not because there's a lack of supply, available supply right now, it's because there's challenges with getting the available supply to market.
Absolutely.
And there's various other related risks and an expectation about the future.
Relative to 2008 and 9, there was a shortage then. This time there is enough food in the world, and it's getting it to the markets.
That's right.
And avoiding some of the distortions that are so tempting.
But it's also generating these politics, right, which are incredibly difficult. And if doing subsidy policy in a peaceful world is tough, it's even tougher, surely, in a world that's in crisis mode, right? Economic policy, good economic policy, isn't always made in a crisis.
Well, that brings me back to the question you posed about the issue of subsidies for semiconductors, industrial policy, friendshoring, if you will. In a world of shocks, multiple shocks, such as we live in now, we've seen, of course, politicians and governments will try to do some of that. But as David said, it's very costly. And the good news is when you talk to business people, they don't quite talk that language. They talk of how they will manage their risks. They talk of diversification of sources of supply. So I think governments may want to do some of this friendshoring and reshoring, but businesses are going to make their calculus slightly differently. And that's what we're finding. So let's see, of course, if I'm a business person and I'm offered a large subsidy to do something, I'll take it with both hands. But ultimately, it's not sustainable for governments. It's very costly. And that is why I think we need to be very, very careful, because not all governments can afford those types of subsidies. It doesn't set a very good example.
Actually, we know that we are in a more shock-prone world. That's a fact. We got the shock of the pandemic. We now have the shock of the war. Locally, we have climate shocks. And that drives the conclusion that we have to work more on supply chain resilience. It has to happen. After the shock of the pandemic, many countries looked into, wait a minute, we are getting all our medicines from one place. We have to diversify. There is nothing wrong in this approach. I don't know whether it applies to semiconductors, but I can objectively say that our institutions have a role to play to build this supply chain resilience, to recognize there is a security issue for the functioning of the economy, and then come up with transparency of how you make this decision. As Matthias said, well motivated, well designed, if subsidies are to be used in place, and something that is missing, some way in which we can review subsidies and then have a fair judgment on what works and what doesn't.
I feel like all four of you lay out an incredibly compelling case for tackling subsidies. I also suspect that when this project began to draft this report, the world was a slightly different place, and the politics out there in the world were slightly different. I wonder, when you think about tackling what has always been a difficult issue in subsidies, and telling governments that they can't do the politically, or they shouldn't do the politically expedient thing sometimes, and do the sensible thing instead. I wonder if you think the world is a more complicated place to make that argument right now.
Of course it is a more complicated place, and we shouldn't minimize that. Of course, the geopolitics is not to be minimized. The need to feel secure in who you trade with and who you, who you do business with. There's that. We'll take it into account. But we're saying, I want to come back to something Kristalina said, all that being given, we need to watch the extent to which we do undervalue what we already have. The cost of pulling back, WTO economists have actually started simulations of this. And they show, just from looking at efficiency losses in scale economies, you lose 5% of GDP in the longer term. That's not trivial. So we need to be saying, yes, the geopolitics will have to take care of some of this business, but to a certain extent only. Beyond that, it will result in losses for everyone, and especially the poorer country.
David?
That was the beginning of this report, that the economic view is clear of the cost of subsidies and the need for efficiency for the world, especially for development. What's changed is 2 points. One is the recognition of how dependent Europe had become on energy from Russia, and the world's recognized that on China. Over-dependency, which is a step that probably the world wanted to do, and even I've argued that for China it will be beneficial to not have people so dependent on them. That gives them more range of motion. So that's an okay step, and also the urgency. Because of the food spikes, this has to be addressed right now, this month, next month, by the world, to hold down trade barriers and to not fall into subsidies that are going to distort all of these markets.
I got to say, like, if anything, the need to tackle this has become more urgent because, I mean, governments around the world have had to spend a lot of money to deal with the impact of the pandemic. They've got to spend a lot of money to deal with many of the challenges that the world is facing. And quite frankly, efficient allocation of limited resources, of limited fiscal resources, should be a key motivating factor to tackle this. We need the world to run on all cylinders, and this is part of what is holding the world back.
Yes, you called one cylinder off. The driver of geopolitical consideration is there, but also the driver of governments having less money is there. And so with interest rates going up, governments having debt to service, they better be smart and not jump into committing to things that they may not be able to pay for.
Can I say one more thing? I think
course.
I think
which
that
is wasteful. On top of it is wasteful.
wasteful.
Yeah.
And that brings me to the point that once you start this subsidy thing, it's a race to the bottom. And poorer countries cannot compete.
That's it.
So we live in a world in which the rich will get to do everything and the poor will get left out. And because they
unfair
don't have the
competition.
fiscal space
Yep.
to do things. So we also need to reflect that type of a world doesn't work.
But do you need a world in which the rich world is helping the poor world extract themselves from these subsidies, right? So for the story that we did on the shocks facing the emerging economies, we sent out reporters around the world, and I was really struck by the story of a Tunisian baker in Tunis, who can't get any flour. And he can't get the subsidized flour, he can't get flour on the black market, he can't afford the flour that's there on the black market. In fact, they were saying that in Tunis it's now easier to get marijuana than it is to get flour, which is a pretty astonishing little insight. But that is, you can look at the government there, and it's a government that is going to be engaging in conversations with you. And you say, how do you get out of that? Because you need to find, government needs to act. There's a market distortion, there's a market problem there. You need to get the flour out there. There needs to be a subsidy.
Well, you can't solve it by pressing a button. You can only solve it by international cooperation and by advanced economies, emerging and developing economies working this out together. And that is what we're saying. That is what is required.
Right. And what we have seen in 2007, 2008 is that when there is strong international cooperation, you can overcome a food crisis. Right. It took us a while, but that is how we got out of it. There are three questions. One, is food being stored in rich countries just as a precaution in quantities that are unnecessary? Two, do we identify where production can be increased, including in low-income countries? In 2007, 2008, we had cases when just by providing seeds and tools to farmers, you get production up. And three, do we have a good information to help us move money and food where it is most needed? So we have identified the 26 countries that are in biggest shot. We are now, and actually the World Bank leads on that, concentrating attention so they have the money, they know where the markets are, they are facilitating buying bulk for multiple countries at the same time. And as David said, this week's, we are coming up with this action plan of international financial institutions, and it is truly pressing to get it to move so we avoid people dying unnecessarily. The food is available, it just has to get to the right place.
2 points. One is for poor people, they can use a targeted subsidy. So a social safety net is different. This report is trying to go at those subsidies that are for producers and consumers that cause distortions. We're not talking about the survival benefits that are needed. And then second is markets look ahead, and businesses, as Ngozi was saying, are really good at looking ahead. So if there can be some vision for the world that there's going to be resolutions, that there's going to be more supply, then people won't stockpile it because they'll see that there's supply coming. One of the worries right now is countries in Europe are trying to stockpile natural gas for next winter. Well, that means that there's not natural gas available for LNG is really needed for making urea, a component of fertilizer and crops. So if we look around the world, that's the highest priority. Let people have that. But the advanced economies can buy up the whole supply and store it up for next winter. It'd be better to say, look, there's going to be enough, and there's going to be extra production and supply to make that possible.
Right. So we have to avoid vaccine 2. A repetition of what was done in the beginning of the
But the vaccine experience was a lesson in the way the world is working today, in which self-interest kind of takes over in a way, doesn't it?
I want to come in, and of course we can't avoid a certain amount of self-interest. But on the vaccines, that's a very bad example, because it's not even in the self-interest of a country in a pandemic to just look after their people.
Yes.
That's right.
Because they're going to get it. This is one problem a country cannot solve. But since I have the floor, just a quick word on industrial subsidies. One of the things that at the WTO we're very worried about is that breaks trust is these hidden industrial subsidies. And this report shows there's a real gap. We don't have enough information. We have a lot of information on agricultural subsidies, thanks to the work of OECD, the World Bank, IMF, you know. But on industrial subsidies, we all need to put our analytical capabilities to work, to get information, so that we can deal with this issue of feeling of unfairness and anti-competitive behavior.
David.
I was going to support information, you know, for the vaccines. One of the things was people didn't know how many options somebody else had. And so and one of our goals in our task force was to get that information out, because it turned out there were enough vaccines. And so on the food, there is that bit of similarity that information will help because there are huge stockpiles of grain in the world. Write them down and see if they can be released.
So for markets to be well functioning, they need to be open and transparent.
Right.
And access to information is critically important.
But we're in a world, again, I hate to be the downer here, but we're in a world in which people aren't necessarily in the mood to share some of that information.
And that is why this conversation is so important. Like, we can't just be limiting ourselves by the challenging situation we're in. We also got to look to where we want to be.
And if you take the vaccine,
in our meeting with Kristalina, Canada said it was going to produce more food. That once that's stated, people begin to adjust. Markets adjust. Sorry, Kristalina.
No, I just wanted to say that in the vaccine story, it took us a while to get everybody, the producers, the organizations that are deploying vaccines. But once we got them in the room, it clarified that we have enough vaccines, that the problems are more around the last mile and distribution, and then you direct resources appropriately. And that is what we need to do on food as well, and we will do it.
There is also a story through history of behavior now affecting what happens next year. You mentioned fertilizers and what's happening there. We're already seeing reports of farmers not planting as much as they would normally this season, which will affect stockpiles going forward. How much do you worry about the shocks we're going through now carrying through until the next few years?
Very worried.
Worried, but individuals are really good at this. And so one of the things is to figure out that information helps. If they know that certain fertilizers are going to be more efficient and are available, farmers will really rise to the occasion. They have to be allowed to do that with information.
And this is why the question of information available to everybody is so important. Let's say something positive. And the positive is that phones, digital technologies have dramatically changed farmers' access to information. And that is what we need to ride on.
So what comes next? We need more information. When do we get this global agreement that everyone's going to get along and not do any subsidizing? That doesn't make sense.
It'll always be work in progress, but it is something that we have to continue working on.
And the good thing is that we are not leaving Gozi alone to go and work with the trade ministers. The reason all of us are here is because good decisions are made when finance ministers are involved, when industry ministers are involved, agriculture ministers are involved, the private sector is involved, and that is our task. This paper, the biggest contribution of the paper is that it brings this multiple perspective, and then we have a better chance when the gang of four, me with wings though, right? when we get in action, good things would happen.
And for me, I have to say that getting this work started gives a lot of hope, because we need to look at some of our agreements at the WTO. And we need to let members know that we are listening to what they're saying. They're very worried about each other's subsidies. So pushing to get more transparency at least will solve part of what they are looking for. It will be a work in progress. I really want to share what Matthias said.
I'm told we have 1 minute left. We could go a lot deeper into this and continue. I want to go through just a very quick lightning round. I've got the 4 guardians of the world economy here on the table. I need to ask you this question. What is the shock you worry about next? What is the shock that you look out on the horizon, you think that's the one that's really going to take us in a different direction? I'll start with you, David.
I think energy is really important to sort out. It underpins fertilizer, it underpins crop yields, and so right now it's in disarray because people don't know how it's going to adjust. So that's the shock. It's going to last into next year.
Matthias?
Well, I mean, the thing that worries me most is that we're not getting issues off the table, that more and more issues are coming on the table. And, you know, we're still dealing with the impact of the pandemic, we're dealing with the impact now of the war, we're dealing with structural transformation, challenges related to climate change, digital transformation, pressure on the rules-based trading system. And I really do hope that we can start taking some of these issues off the table.
Can I be greedy and say there are 2 things I'm worried about? One is geopolitical miscalculation, that some powers miscalculate each other's intentions and that the conflicts and wars spread faster. I'm really worried about that because the element of mistrust that exists in the world now is significant. The second thing that worries me is another pandemic, because I don't really feel that we're prepared yet to deal with another one.
I'm going to close with our host.
I worry most about multiple shocks simultaneously hitting us and our proven inability to deal with more than one crisis at one time. Building that capacity to anticipate crisis and then build resilience to crisis and act on multiple crises is what I worry we are slow to build.
Well, thank you to all 4 of you and to all of your staff who came up with this very good report, and it's one that you really should read. It is available on the websites of all 4 of these organizations, I'm sure. Thank you to all of you out there in the virtual world, and thank you to everyone here in the studio.
Did we show you?
And with that, the only thing I have left to wish you, oh, there's the report there, do you see it? The only thing I have left to say to you at this point is have a very good Friday afternoon. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.